There wasn't a street that didn't lose a kid.
Are you going to jump or are you going to burn to death?
You could have a healthy Chicagoan literally be dead within 24 hours.
On the Pullman car, you were treated like royalty.
Without the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, there probably would be no modern civil rights movement.
Chicago, more than any other city in America, truly embodies our nation's sweet tooth.
Addams thought she would socialize democracy across class lines, across race lines.
These women were not going to take no for an answer.
Sears and Ward's catalogs, those were a holy grail in my house.
Everything is in there.
It was like this massive release of anger and just this cry for change.
If you were an alderman or if you were another elected official, you wanted things done for your ward, you had to go kiss the ring in City Hall, and that was the mayor.
As mayor of Chicago, I shall have only one goal: to make this city a better and more beautiful place in which to live.
The new season of Chicago Stories debuts on WTTW here in Chicago on Friday, September 22nd. And as he owes me money, I was able to get one of the producers of the series to join me today to talk about the show. Eddie Griffin, welcome.
Tommy, thank you very much. Coming to visit you is like the victory cigar moment of each project, because that means we're close to the air date and everything's done. No more edits, no more fixes, no more tweaks. It's showtime.
You are a smooth talker. So for listeners, please share a little bit of your Chicago background, including how you got involved with WTTW and about your lengthy arrest record.
Where do I start with that one? I've been at WTTW now for over 15 years. I've done a lot of local documentaries, which is kind of our bread and butter, obviously, is, to tell Chicago stories. And now I happen to be working on the series Chicago Stories, which has been, they're hour-long documentaries, but it's part of a series. And so, we want to tell the iconic Chicago stories, the things of the stuff of legend, the things that make the city what it is. And Chicago Stories has been our way, WTW's way of putting our stamp on a story and kind of becoming the official story or documentary of record. And so that part has been really cool to kind of like not only learn these stories, because a lot of them are stuff you've heard of. Everyone has heard that Chicago reversed the river. But do you know how? Do you know why? Do you know how long it took? Do you know that it took 8 years? That it was a major undertaking. So we kind of get to the bottom of things like that to kind of fill in everyone, so that you've referenced all these things. People know of it, but do they know how, the why? And that's kind of where we come in with this documentary series.
You grew up in Chicago, as I recall, South Side, Beverly neighborhood.
Yep, absolutely. South Side.
I noticed
Christ the King Parish.
Oh, okay. I noticed the Beverly poster over your shoulder. I love the company that does those. How did you settle on the 4 posters behind you?
Because that's all where I've lived before. So I kind of started far South Side, and then as I, started working at WTTW, I kind of made my way north, and I've lived in the South Loop, Lincoln Square, and then Old Town now.
One step ahead of the feds at every point.
That's, you got to move every couple of years so they don't forward the forwarding address.
Otherwise, they're going to track you down. So of the 8 episodes in Chicago Story Season 2, how do you producers get selected? Are you assigned the topics? Are you able to request the ones that you're really interested in doing?
A little bit of both. We've got like this is a big team, which is also kind of a change for how I've normally worked, to where we've, it's an episodic, it's a series. So we've got an executive producer, Anna Gardner. We've got the vice president of local production, Shelley Spencer. And the larger group is always, looking, what stories do we need to tell? They're researching, they're pitching, they're coming up with ideas. And that could be, anything from just a title, a concept, to like a full-blown one-pager, a full-blown pitch. And that group sort of sits down and says, what makes sense to put shows together? Like, yeah, we'd love to tell 100 documentaries that take place in 1850, but we kind of want to have some variety and, tell stories that take place across, multiple time periods, featuring different stories, different characters, diverse backgrounds. So they kind of come up with like a master list. And then, as producers like myself start to get wind of what's on that list, you start to angle for maybe those stories that you want. I'd love to get. I'm always interested in candy. What do I know about that? What do you think you've got going for that? So I think after a while, before anything gets done, before anyone really starts to put pen to paper, really starts to research or even shoot and edit, there's a big collective group of like what makes sense for us to tell now and why.
So roundtable discussion where everybody kind of throws in their ideas and you narrow it down to the best ofs for season 2. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh,
exactly.
fantastic. I did get access to some of the advanced screenings, including the race to reverse the river. Of course, as a fan of alliterative titles, trying to say that 3 times fast, I wondered to myself, did Eddie Griffin pick the name for this episode?
I cannot take credit for that one. I thought there was a point where I think we had just, the description of the show was the title, what about the reversal of the river? And to their credit, our marketing team, everyone got together and said, the titles need to sell themselves a little more. And I think as a producer, I was like, oh, what does that mean? Like, you're going to take away the meaning. The race to reverse of the river. Once I saw that on paper, that was like, oh my God, what a perfect title, because there's urgency, and there really was to that story. They had to get this done by a certain point, because otherwise St. Louis, which is where we were going to reverse the river to, took this to the Supreme Court to try to block them. So there was urgency. And so I think once the full season got all their titles in order, it made a lot more sense to be like, oh, these are kind of jumping off the page as just, rather than just whatever the story was, whatever the concept was, just calling it that. These were, they had a little bit more flair to it, which was really cool to see.
I enjoyed the story, and honestly, I knew very little about it. It was one of those things that I'd always meant to research, and so I'm glad you guys did it. But the idea of taking all of our waste and just sending it downriver, I truly thought to myself, like, well, it still is waste, and it still has to go somewhere. Like, somebody's going to end up with all of our wastewater. So it was great to see kind of how all that came about and its effects on the environment and the ecology and everything else down the line.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of, as a documentary producer, you put yourself in their position, and people were dying because the waste was going into the river and then going into the lake, and that's where the city was getting its drinking water from. And as the city started to grow, there was more and more waste, more and more people, more and more waste. And it got to the point of, what else are we going to do? There was, even before the sewer system got built, people had an outhouse, and that outhouse just kind of cycled into the groundwater and it made its way into the river and then into the lake. And you give them credit because they said, all right, something has to be done. This population is getting sick. This population is dying. And, I'm sure St. Louis and even people downstate Illinois don't want to hear it, but they had to do something, and we'll figure out the consequences later. We need to save in 1890 the 550,000 people living in Chicago. We've got to get this waste out of here, and the river going backwards to the Mississippi was the solution. And it's kind of what makes these stories great, is like, isn't that such a Chicago thing to be like, hey, we're just going to do this, we're going to send this down, and we're going to get it built before you guys could step in and say no.
Spoiler, there's a great scene where there's some really nice recreations, old-timey costumes and the whole bit. And there's a scene where guys basically go out and try to open up the dam on their own with a couple of shovels just to get things moving, to stave off this injunction coming up from the South, which I thought was kind of a nice touch as well. Were you on set for those filming? Yeah, so you were there for the whole bit.
Yeah, we filmed those
really
recreations where we, there's the point is that St. Louis was hot on their tails to get it shut down and gone to the Supreme Court. And they just thought, well, if we get in there, we dig it open and we get this thing rolling, there's no way you can stop it. I mean, it's 2 billion gallons of water coming a day. Like, you can't stop it once it's open. So the trustees the engineers break in the middle of the night and just kind of shovel out that last bit of earth and dam that is there blocking the river. And then the river start flowing into the canal, and the whole process has started. And it's just like, okay, now what are you going to do? You can't stop us.
It
So
truly is the Chicago way, right?
it is the Chicago way, but
Yeah.
there was, a limited photo. So, that's such a great story that we've got to tell. But there were some photographs of that day, but not enough to really flesh it out and to build on it. So, we do what we call recreations, or you'll see those in other shows as dramatizations, but we're just trying to recreate what happened. So we found a nice stretch of land at the old Stearns Quarry, Palmisano Park in Bridgeport, that would have looked roughly, that's the ground below the surface here. So that was essentially what they were in, right near where they were digging. We got some great actors, and our director of photography, Oral User, was like just amazing in how it was filmed, how it was shot. We had great lighting that day, a lot of wind that kind of, picked up some of the, the bunting and the clothing, and, just all of a sudden it's like, yeah, we went from making a documentary to like directing actors and, getting it almost felt like a narrative film. Very cool experience.
Yeah, it looked amazing. And honestly, I didn't realize, so my hometown of Lamont, Illinois was kind of a big part of this process. And you had a nice little segment there. And so I thought to myself, I wonder if my old English teacher from high school, who used to write for the local paper and do a lot of history stuff, ever talked about this. And sure enough, I found in the old Lamont newspapers, she talked about the very days where people would come out and kind of set up picnics and watch as all this stuff was happening. So it was great to see. It's fascinating. I like the you have kind of a cartoon recreation of what is it called? The ridge that the water had to flow over. Anyway, it all was pretty fascinating to me, and honestly, I'm looking forward to watching it again. I could ramble on about this for a little bit, but I do want to get to Candy Capital again. Alliteration. You guys are all about that. Candy companies in Chicago. I thought I had a pretty good understanding of candy manufacturing in Chicago, and I felt like I maybe knew 15% of all the stuff going on there. Was it the same for you?
Absolutely. I think what I found, or what I realized, is that these are the brands that came from Chicago are the biggest brands in the world. You're talking Mars, that's Snickers, and Milky Way and Three Musketeers. You've got Curtis, who made Baby Ruth and Butterfinger. All of the Ferrara pan candy, which is all like Lemon Heads and Red Hots. Like, these are the biggest candies in the world, and you almost take for granted that they all came from here. And essentially, they all came from like Chicago's West Side, where all the factories were. And you've got Hershey on the East Coast, and Nestle, of course, in Switzerland. But almost every other recognizable brand of candy in the world comes from Chicago. And they're so big that you just almost take it for granted. Like, oh yeah, all those candy bars, maybe they had, just a couple chocolate manufacturers here. But no, the biggest brands were launched, were invented, were created here. And I've known about that Chicago is referred to as a candy capital for a long time, and covered it in other shows. But when you actually sit down and realize that that all came from here, it's actually pretty mind-blowing that what was going on in Chicago in that time period to allow that to happen. And that's where the story takes us.
Well, and you assume that things like caramels have been around for hundreds of years, but it turns out not really. The idea of creating caramels and dipping them into chocolate and the simplest of things that we take for granted now were pretty revolutionary, back to the World's Fair of 1893, where people were introducing stuff. But hearing about the women in their kitchens basically making candy, like, starting out and doing this and trying to make a living at it was pretty easy to do back in the day. And then if you were able to ramp up like some of these guys did, you could make a fine living at it.
Yeah, and you talk to candy makers even today, and they tell you like their margins are incredibly small. Like, yes, they can make a lot of money, and there's certainly some candy companies that are, there's their values in the B's. But when you talk to them, they tell you that what they make, their margins are so razor thin So all the costs that they can cut down on shipping, on transportation, on buying in bulk, is what makes Chicago a prime candidate for candy manufacturing. At least, in the early 1900s, was that Chicago had all the shipping lanes. We had, we were the railroad hub of the United States, so that cut the costs down. And there's Mars starts in Minneapolis, but they come to Chicago to get going because, well, all these other candy firms are there. Everyone else is buying sugar, they're buying dairy, corn for sucrose is coming from Iowa, and it's all coming here. And you can make more money because you've got more trains, you got more shipments coming into here. So it's, once the original base starts to build up, then if you're in the candy business, you've got to come to Chicago because that's where everyone is and that's where the incentives are. So it becomes a business story. It becomes a business story, and it's also sadly why some of these candy firms aren't around anymore because of the way the industry went. As we get into the 2000s and more recent times.
Well, everybody's always looking for a way to shave a couple cents off of everything they do. And unfortunately, that means moving to less expensive areas. You cover things like sugar beets, which quite frankly, I never really thought much about sugar. I thought sugar cane, and no, you guys talked about sugar beets and a lot of the aspects that go into making the candy that everybody has fallen in love with. And as a history nerd and a fan of candy, probably more than I should be at my age, it was all pretty amazing. So nicely done. Now, working on these 2 episodes, what would you say was the most surprising thing that you learned?
For the Race to Reverse the River was just the scale. I mean, when we talk about reversing the river, what we're talking about is building the canal that then runs, below, not underneath, but it runs lower than the level of the lake, so that when you open up the gates at Lake Michigan, water can just kind of flow from gravity down to Joliet, which is like 40 feet lower than Lake Michigan is. So in order to build that, you've got to build a canal that's 28 miles long and I think like 12 feet deep and 18 feet wide, something like that in some places. It took 8 years. So when we talk about, engineering, we talk about, this had to be done. Yeah, the city was, in a race for survival, but the solution took 8 years. And I think just when you break it out, when you realize how big of a construction project it was, 275 construction workers died in the 8 years of building the canal. I mean, if you have, God forbid, one death in a construction project today, you're shut down. 275 people died, which just shows you the scale of this. I mean, they're using dynamite, they're living in poor conditions. It was dangerous work. And you don't think when you look at the canal, it's just a little peaceful flowing stream of water. You don't see that could have been that dangerous and that big of a proportion of work. So that, just knowing that, God, this took 8 years, countless people, the people who worked on it at the beginning were not the people who finished it at the end. Those jobs had changed over. And so you just think like quick fix solutions. And this was not that. This was a long, painstaking process to save the city.
You mentioned the 275 workers who died during construction. You also talked in the episode about civilians watching the blasting going on, and a chunk of rock flew up and hit some guy in the head as he was watching. I think it might have been in Lamont. And I thought, boy, that's a horrifying way, long before TV, to get your entertainment, is to avoid flying bricks and such. You also talked about the water cribs, which I love because I did a lot of research on the water cribs, and the idea of starting a tunnel out in the lake, 2 miles out in the lake, and then at the shoreline and meeting in the center. And as I recall, they were only like a 1/4 inch off, which that to me was mind-boggling. So yeah, there's a lot to be learned in that episode. I feel like I'm going to have to watch it at least 3 or 4 more times and then try to get the script from Robert Loerzel, who wrote it, just to get more details, because wow, it was pretty stunning in a lot of ways. These are just 2 of the 8 episodes that are going to be premiering. You've seen more of the other ones, any of the other ones, or have you just been too busy finishing these up?
I'm trying to get eyeballs on some of the other ones, trying to get, sneak peak premieres on some of them. But yeah, Friday, September 22nd, 8 p.m. The premiere episode is actually Our Lady of the Angels, the school fire of 1958.
Sure. You want to start with a really upbeat topic?
Yeah, I mean,
oh boy.
Yeah, I mean, well, luckily, we've got, well, not luckily, but, we got fire. You've got the death and disease of the river. We got Danny Sotomayor, who's an AIDS activist. Jane Addams. There's urban renewal, and then there's Candy. Candy is the honestly, one uplifting episode of the series.
Yeah, the river and Candy. You kind of got the lightest stuff of all of them. So you didn't have to go home depressed at the end of the day.
That was. Yeah, give credit to Anna and Shelley on that one of like, as they're kind of filling in the season, it's like, oh man, we've got to lift some people up here. We've got to, and of course, Candy is not all sweets and not all sweets and giggles. But overall, that was sort of like the, a fun episode, but, we still have some drama in there. So don't worry.
Well, I almost forgot as I was watching the Candy episode, you mentioned Charles Gunther, and I thought, oh, I wonder if they're going to mention that he was the guy who brought the Libby prison, the Union prison from the South, up to Chicago to be used as a museum. And sure enough, you guys covered it. So, kudos on covering all your bases because, I didn't see anything there that was missed. So nicely done.
Thank you. The thing about the candy or candy makers was that someone says along the way of like candy is basically sugar, chocolate, and nuts. Like there's only so much you can do with it. And so the reason some of these firms, these brands become successful is the salesmanship, the marketing genius of the company owners, and to promote their brands and to flood the market, and to come up with these graphic designs that made you want their version of candy. And obviously William Wrigley, it was just gum. It was just gum, and he turns it into this billion-dollar empire because of the marketing and the sales approach that they took to kind of wipe away the competition.
Chicago Stories premieres September 22nd at 8 p.m. on WTTW and online soon after at WTTW.com/Chicago Stories. Eddie Griffin, thanks so much for being here today.
Tommy, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.